We all know about the first mover advantage in business, but do you know about the first mover advantage in a negotiation or in a courtroom? Well, the reason the advantage works in these contexts is the same as why we often fail to fully understand the point of view of others. That common reason is anchoring. In this video, I will look at some of the impacts of anchoring on our decisions and judgments. I will then take a closer look at the workings of the bias to arrive at some strategies to manage its impact on our decisions. But first, let's take a look at an example of anchoring in Stanley Kubrick's anti-war classic, Paths of Glory. Colonel Dax of the French army is forced to launch an impossible attack against a highly fortified German position. The attack fails, many lives are lost, and some soldiers refuse to advance, seeing the carnage. After the attack, some high-ranking generals decide to scapegoat 3 randomly selected soldiers and charge them with cowardice. Now, despite Colonel Dax's efforts to defend his soldiers, they are executed. Meanwhile, Dax finds out that his superior had ordered artillery fire on his own troops who had refused to advance. He reports this to Broulard, a high-ranking general who orders a public inquiry into the matter. Broulard offers the superior's position to Dax, who's surprised by the offer. Broulard responds by suggesting that it is obvious that Dax defended the men and reported his superior only to get a promotion. Dax is outraged by the suggestion, refuses the offer, and tells Broulard to go to hell. General Broulard's misjudgment of Dax's perspective was partly because he assumed that Dax's motivation and sentiments were the same as his own, which can be attributed to the anchoring effect. Before we move forward, remember, if you would like to see more of such content, support the channel by liking, subscribing, and commenting. Now, let's get started. The anchoring effect occurs when we rely too heavily on an initial reference point or an anchor while making a decision. For example, in an experiment, participants were first asked to write the last 2 digits of their social security numbers. They were then asked to consider whether they would pay this number of dollars for items whose value they did not know, such as wine, chocolate, and computer equipment. Later, they were asked to actually bid for these items. Participants with higher 2-digit numbers submitted bids that were almost double than those with lower numbers. Therefore, their social security numbers had become their anchors, even though they were completely unrelated to the value of items they had to bid for. These anchors may either be self-generated from memory and knowledge, or they may be acquired from the immediate external environment. Subsequent information is not as impactful on the decision as the initial anchor. Even completely irrelevant and uninformative anchors can also impact our decisions. Now, anchoring effects have been found to impact multiple aspects of our personal and professional lives, and some of the impacts are not in our interest. Let's look at these. Firstly, studies have found that judges anchor their sentencing decisions on sentencing demands, even when these demands come from irrelevant sources or are generated by judges themselves randomly with a throw of dice. Anchoring has also been found to have a powerful impact on negotiations, like salary negotiations. Here, the first offer becomes the anchor, and the final agreed value often doesn't stray too far from it. Therefore, the person who makes the first offer in a negotiation gains an advantage over others. Next, anchoring has even been observed in estimating the magnitude of physical stimuli like length, weight, and loudness. For example, while judging the weight of an object, if we encounter a lighter object first, our estimates are likely to be lower than if we encounter a heavier object first. Another domain where strong anchoring effects are observed is perspective taking. To estimate the point of view of others, we first anchor on our own perspective, assuming that others will share it. This is called egocentric anchoring. Subsequently, if we feel that others have a different situation, background, or knowledge, we modify or adjust the point of view. But often this adjustment is insufficient, and therefore we are unable to fully understand others' perspectives. Now, if we want to avoid the undesirable impacts of anchoring on our decisions and use the bias to our advantage, we will need to understand anchoring effects better. Let's start by looking at its cognitive causes, which are the psychological mechanisms that explain the bias. Firstly, when the answer to a question is unknown or is difficult to determine, we often try to approximate it by substituting the question with an easier question whose answer is known and is likely to be close to the right answer. This substitute answer becomes the anchor, which is then adjusted until it seems close enough to the right answer. For example, to estimate the distance between two towns, we may anchor on the number of train stations between the towns and then adjust from there. This process is known as anchoring and adjustment, and it mostly comes into play when the anchor is self-generated. Now, the problem with this approach is that we often stop adjusting when the answer seems close enough, rather than continuing to adjust till we get a more accurate answer. This insufficient adjustment is a result of us trying to minimize the mental effort and attention required for adjustment. Sometimes, the adjustment process may also be triggered by anchors acquired from the external environment, if these anchors are perceived to be a hint towards the answer, but too extreme to be the right answer and therefore requiring some adjustment. But in most cases where the anchor is provided by an external source, we engage in a kind of hypothesis testing to evaluate whether the anchor is the right answer. But as we have seen in the case of confirmation bias, link to the video in ticker if you've not seen it, we automatically tend to test hypothesis by looking for evidence that confirms it rather than evidence that disconfirms it. This means that we will pay more attention to information that is consistent with the anchor and thus be biased towards the anchor. This is referred to as the selective accessibility model. The confirmatory hypothesis testing process is largely unconscious and automatic, which means that we often are completely unaware of the impact of external anchors on our decisions. And lastly, the study of attitude change has contributed to our understanding of anchoring by integrating the adjustment and selective accessibility models. An attitude change occurs when a relatively stable attitude is modified to meet the demands of a particular situation or new information. Now, this process resembles anchoring and adjustment, wherein the existing attitude is the anchor, which is then adjusted based on evaluation of the situation and relevant knowledge in our memory, which can be consistent or inconsistent with the anchor. Next, looking at the neural basis of anchoring and adjustment, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex has been found to be involved in the adjustment process. This brain region integrates information from the risk and reward centers of the brain as well as from memory and informs decision making. Activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex seems to lead to more adjustment and lesser overall anchoring. Interestingly, this region has also been found to play a role in confirmatory hypothesis testing. Now let's try to understand why humans exhibit anchoring effects. After all, for us to have inherited this tendency from our ancestors, it must offer at least some evolutionary advantages. Firstly, our susceptibility to external anchors may be a product of social exchanges within tribes and small communities in which our early ancestors lived. In such groups, where trust and cooperation between members is high, we'd have good reason to believe that people providing us with an anchor would do so only if it conveys meaningful information. Next, some researchers suggest that we often adjust insufficiently because we adapt the number of adjustments to rationally allocate mental effort and time. When errors can have serious impacts, we invest more time and effort in adjustments so that we are more accurate. But when we feel that time and mental effort can be put to better use, then we adjust lesser and hence are less accurate. And lastly, anchoring and adjustment help us make decisions in face of uncertainty. When our knowledge is insufficient to make an accurate judgment, anchoring and adjustment enable us to put forth our best guess, which in many cases is a better strategy than delayed decision or indecision. Now that we understand how anchoring works and why it exists, we are in a position to look at some strategies to manage the undesirable impacts of anchoring and use the bias to our advantage. When insufficient adjustments is the primary cause of anchoring effects, strategies that increase mental effort are effective in reducing anchoring. One such strategy is prompts and warnings that inform decision makers that they are susceptible to anchoring and that they should try to adjust further away from such anchors. Another strategy is to offer incentives for accuracy, so decision makers spend more time and effort on adjusting. Next, we adjust more when we are more certain of the direction in which to adjust from the anchor. Where possible, guidance about the direction of adjustment can be provided to decision makers along with incentives and prompts. Next, characteristics of the anchor can also impact the magnitude of anchoring. Anchors that just precede decision making are more effective than those that are presented either earlier or subsequently. Numerical anchors that are precise lead to lesser anchoring compared to anchors that are rounded. This is because precise anchors lead to adjustment on a scale with finer resolution, while rounded anchors lead to big jumps while adjusting. Also, anchors work within a range where they are likely to be the correct answer, but if they are too extreme, they may be completely ignored. Next, characteristics of decision makers also impact anchoring effects. Expertise and familiarity with the subject matter of an anchor reduce anchoring effects in some cases, but not always, as even experts are susceptible to automatic confirmatory hypothesis testing. Egocentric anchoring in perspective taking has been found to reduce with age. Also, personality traits that activate selective accessibility and confirmatory search mechanisms make individuals more susceptible to anchoring effects. Individuals with high conscientiousness engage in more thorough thought processes before making a judgment. Those with high agreeableness take the presented anchors more seriously, and individuals with high openness to experience are more sensitive to anchor cues. Next, the state of the decision maker also impacts anchoring effect. Stress and cognitive load compete with the mental efforts required for adjusting and therefore lead to larger anchoring. Also, emotions that lead to more thorough thought processes, such as sadness, activate confirmatory search. And finally, when presented with an anchor in form of the first offer during a negotiation, a few steps we can take to minimize the effects of anchoring on our decisions are to consider whether the opponent has any other alternatives to negotiation, think about what the minimum value acceptable to the opponent might be, and think about our own target value rather than the minimum value acceptable to us. And to conclude, let's look back at the story of the French military officials from Paths of Glory. Broulard failed to understand Dax's motivations and sentiments about the issue because he assumed that Dax was as selfish and ruthless as himself. This is a clear example of egocentric anchoring and insufficient adjustment. Go watch this scathing critique of war, politics and class divide to find out what really drives Colonel Dax's actions. If you've made it to the end of the video, you would probably enjoy watching the rest of my videos, so please go check them out. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and before the libertarian paternalists come to nudge you, you better go nudge yourself. See you next time.